This may be the best book on finance and economics I've read in a very, very long time. Let us say you are now the new czar of all things economy. What would czars, Kyla, do?
A lot of the solutions do come down to policy.
Could you explain why maybe people shouldn't be thinking about owning a home as the best way to grow wealth?
Yeah, this is a tough conversation.
A lot of people aspired or looked up to people like Steve Jobs. Now, lack of leadership at these executive levels of these big companies is probably one of the reasons sort of indirectly leading to wide recession.
In terms of just tech leaders in general and how they lead companies, it's definitely not, Steve Jobs. It's not about inspiration as much as it used to be. And then when you look to, politics, it's the same sort of situation where it's like, who do you look up to? And so you can definitely look to that and extrapolate to the American dream and say, people don't trust in institutions, and they definitely don't trust in the American dream.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very, very special guest for you today on the Aarthi and Sriram show. This is someone who I have become a real fan of over the last several months for the work she does on making economics policy, what is happening in the world, just easy and understandable. And I think it's so rare to find someone who can take something ridiculously complicated and then actually make it engaging, fun, interesting. So we have the one and only Kyla Scanlon here on the show today. So Kyla, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
How do you actually direct sentiment in a way which is economically sensible and sustainable using the tools you have, which is the interest rate, taxation, which are kind of the easier tools that you have, and then maybe, various other kind of laws and legislation which take longer periods of time. But here's a hypothetical, right? Let us say you are now master of the economy. Someone has imbued you with the executive, legal, judicial, magical powers where you can set any policy, any legislation, let's say in the United States, right? Let's scope this down. And your job is to set the economy on the most optimum stable path, which may or may not include people feeling good about it, because as you say, they kind of have a connection. So if you had this said magical power, right, who was the president in January 1st says Kyla is the new, czar, they like the word czar, of all things economy. What would czars, Kyla, do?
Yeah, I think that this is something I talk about toward the end of the book, the opportunities and the problems that we're facing. And I think I address most of those problems. I think a lot of the negative sentiment, at least in the United States and actually in the UK too, is around housing. We desperately need more housing. We need cities that are sort of designed for people. Here in the US, they're very much designed around cars, except for New York City. So I think if we can have transports that gets people to work faster, enables them to be in third places like that, it's a little woo-woo, right? But I think that would do a lot for improving consumer sentiment. I also think there needs to be a social safety net. And that, of course, raises eyebrows because people are like, that's expensive. But I do think that knowing that there's a net for people would be extremely important. People spend a lot of money and there's a lot of fear and uncertainty if you're, facing a bad time and not able to get out of it. So I think this would be kind of what I would start with. And that's very reductive. But housing is a big part of it.
This is a great segue because I was watching your podcast with Scott Galloway. And Scott and I disagree on a lot of things, but your episode was fantastic, right? But Scott knows this. And one of the things you brought up briefly, which really surprised me, and I think it's an example of how we have these great, ideas which rebut and overturn existing wisdom, is you talk about housing and the role it psychologically plays in wealth in the US, right? And, maybe could you explain why maybe people shouldn't be thinking about owning a home as the best way to grow wealth and maybe some of the historical data? Because I think you made a fascinating point on that.
Yeah, this is a tough conversation. My favorite chart, I talk about it, I think I talk about it almost every day of my life at this point. My favorite chart is the distribution of financial assets from the Federal Reserve, who is the central bank of the United States. And it's this chart that shows at the bottom 50%, all of their wealth is tied up into real estate. But the top 10%, they own stocks and they own businesses. And so it's kind of this like hidden story that's woven into this bar chart, where you can look at this chart and say, oh, wealth actually doesn't come through owning a home. It probably comes through owning stocks, and it probably comes from having exposure to businesses, whether that being a small business owner investing in private businesses or being a part of an employee stock option program. Those are sort of some examples of how you can gain wealth through that avenue. Mm-hmm. But in the US, we use homes as a way to build wealth. And the problem with that is it's extraordinarily expensive to get a home right now.
Yeah.
Mortgage rates are above 7% because the Federal Reserve has been raising rates in order to battle inflation. Homes are extremely expensive because there isn't enough of them. Also, the move to remote work pushed up home prices by 24%, according to research from the San Francisco Fed. And so you have a lot of people who are looking around and saying, like, I don't know how I'm going to get access to this supposedly, wealth building opportunity. And so I don't know if we need to look at it differently. But Derek Thompson from The Atlantic, we do need to look at it differently. I do know that. Derek Thompson from The Atlantic wrote this incredibly good piece talking about how we view homes as both a speculative asset and then also something that we're meant to live in. Yes. And that sort of push and pull makes it extremely difficult, right? Like, it creates incentives for NIMBYism, not in my backyard, don't build around me. It creates incentives for people to kind of hoard wealth in their homes, maybe not move out, to sort of let the new generation of homeowners come in. Like baby boomers own, I think it's 24% of all 3 and 4 bedroom homes, and millennials own like 14%. I might be off on the statistics, but there's a lot of tax incentives in the United States for people to hold on to their homes forever because it is this sort of wealth building opportunity. But you have this generation that's extremely frustrated by that, and because it's the main way to build wealth in the U.S.
I'm curious to get your reaction to this because look, we lived in the US in our adult lives, but we didn't grow up here. But I do think, part of what you're talking about is the Gen Z generation, folks below maybe the age of 25 today, feel a sense of, well, I would say a lack of optimism about the economy. And maybe the American promise, the American social compact that was promised to their parents and grandparents. And for me, it feels like a core part of that promise was a home, right? Like the home, the fence, the picket fence, that was kind of the social compact of when you grew up, this was the life you choose to lead. This is what was promised to you. Do you think that, we almost need a narrative shift away from that, which is like, hey, this is not a thing that maybe you should be aspiring to own to because it doesn't make financial sense for you to do so?
Yeah, you can tell people that, but they're not going to listen because that's what they know. And so I think there could be a push toward that. But I mean, you're right. Like it's the American dream. Like the white picket fence is what people know and it's what they think about. So I really think it needs, and it's tough because a lot of the solutions do come down to policy, but I think it's more so that we have to help people diversify away from homes. Like I think people owning a home makes perfect sense. But how do we get people to invest in the stock market? 62% of Americans are invested, but a lot of times it's through an employer's 401k program, which is the retirement program in the United States. So it's really about that. Like, is it baby bonds? Giving people access to a bond when they're born, and that bond accrues value over time as they age. Is it allowing for more small business loans? Is it looking into employee stock option programs? Is it rethinking private market regulations? So I think it's, home ownership is always going to be this really strange thing because of the weirdness of the 30-year mortgage in the US where you're tied to your house for 30 years for most of the time. A lot of people move, right? But it's a model that has worked, but you're right, like it's not working the way that it used to. And you can see that in polls, like, the trust that young people have in institutions, according to the recent Harvard Youth poll, that was published in April 2024 is down tremendously. The only institution that has gained in trust is the United Nations. And so you can definitely look to that and extrapolate to the American dream and say, people don't trust in institutions, and they definitely don't trust in the American dream.
Wow. Oh, I didn't know about this report, but yeah, I have to go read it now. Somewhat related to this, I was listening to some of your, former, like previous episodes on your podcast, right? And you made this very interesting line, which was a lot of people aspired or looked up to people like Steve Jobs. And now lack of leader or lack of leadership at these like executive levels of these big companies is probably one of the reasons sort of indirectly leading to wide session. And you'd also sort of like made this very interesting commentary because, for me and Sriram, tech is sort of like our world, and this is where we like are from. And so getting your perspective was very interesting. Can you expand on that a second on like leadership, Steve Jobs, and then you'd also talked about going to Mars and Elon Musk and that side of things, and why that's not quite a swap for Steve Jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think Elon Musk has accomplished a lot of impressive things. Starlink, SpaceX, what he has done to advance electric vehicles and make them something that people actually think about and take seriously. It's all very admirable. But I think, in terms of just tech leaders in general and how they lead companies, it's definitely not, Steve Jobs. It's not about inspiration as much as it used to be. You kind of see that with Apple and how they market their products. It's a little bit flatter. A lot of people would tweet out after an Apple keynote and be like, Steve Jobs is rolling in his grave. And so I think that's the issue, right? And then when you look to, politics, it's the same sort of situation where it's like, who do you look up to in this realm? And I think a lot of people have stepped up and have tried to become a role model for younger people. But there's kind of this, and I don't have data around this, so it's just speculation, but there's sort of this like intergenerational warfare because people are like living longer, they're taking longer to retire. There's just not investment in the younger generation. You see that with trade specifically, like tool belt jobs, plumbers. There was a great article, from Mother Jones, but it's talking about how a lot of trade executives are choosing not to invest in younger people. And of course, when we look around and we're like, we don't have enough plumbers, we don't have enough electricians, it's because of that lack of investment in training. And that ties right into the lack of leadership. So that's more speculation. I don't know if that's truly leading to the leadership crisis, but I'm not the first person to talk about that.
I want to talk about the book. So the book is In This Economy, and I would say, kind of, I think Morgan Housel, writes the kind of the introduction, and I think maybe compared to his book, this may be the best book on finance and economics I've read in a very, very long time. So just so strongly endorse anyone watching this to go get out and buy it. I'm guessing the question is, why a book? Because you are, fantastic at social, explaining things, so why the book, and what maybe surprised you in how it has been received? It's been out for, I think, a few weeks now or a few months now.
Yeah.
Oh, God, there you go. Congratulations. So what has maybe surprised you or not surprised you about the reaction it's gotten?
It's been amazing. Like, I've been super grateful. I think the hardest thing, like, candidly, is just getting it out of the econ sphere. It's like, how do you get a person who is, working a 9 to 5 and, they don't maybe want to know about the nuances of the economy, and you can't blame them. And so I think that's kind of been what I've been trying to think about. It's like, it is important, I think, for voters to understand the economy. We had the first presidential debate last night, and none of that was really about economic policy, but it's important to understand the world that you live in, right? It's a civic duty, I believe. And so I think that's kind of how I've tried to think about the book, is like, it's a tool guide for people who want to understand the foundation of what they interact with every day. Like, everything we do is an economic transaction, right? Like buying a cup of coffee, the microphone that I'm talking into, it requires labor, it requires raw materials, it requires commerce, and all of that ties into the economy at large. I think a lot of the negative sentiment is just confusion and uncertainty. And so for me, the reason I wrote the book is because I wanted to help reduce that. And then I also thought it'd be useful to have a static guide for people to go to. There's a lot of really good resources online, a lot of good YouTube channels, a lot of good social media videos, but that gets lost in the noise of the online sphere. And so I wanted to just create a place where people could go and sort of focus on something at once, like just one thing at one time. Mm-hmm. And I really love books. I'm a big reader. And so when I was approached with the book deal, I was like, this is a very big personal goal. So like there's a personal component to it too.
I'll say this, that is, I think a lot of people can resonate with this. I think it's amazing. It's actually having a written book. And, maybe it's, and I know it's super hard, intense. Do you think having gotten to that, do you think it was worth it? Because books often don't make economic sense, but they are great and just, do you feel like, great, this was job well done?
So the thing is, like with anything, you're always like, they could do better. And so, it's been out for a month and I was like, oh, I should have done this and I should have done that. And I'm still going around and talking about it. And luckily it's relevant for hopefully a while. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I still would have done it. It was, there's 60 illustrations. I did the illustrations. Mm-hmm. It was just kind of, I think, accumulation for me of all the research of the past few years and all the time that I've made over 700 videos on the social media sites. And so it's kind of making those long lasting from a personal level, right? And then also from a societal level, I'm just hoping it's useful. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of worry. And I think that the more that we can give people signal that cuts through noise, which I hope the book is, the better, right? Because there's so much stuff out there. It's just getting worse with the AI production. And I think it'll be important to have something to go to. Yeah.
I think that's true. I think you do two very essential things, and in the book, but also on everything you do on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, etc., which is one, you simplify the economy and what's happening in the world for an audience, especially an audience of young people. But I also think you help explain how young people, Gen Z, what do you want to call them, are feeling to people who are not part of the age group, like, people, boomers, Aarthi and me, right? We are oldies. And I'm guessing when you talk to, what do you think people in their 30s, 40s, what do you think they don't understand about the mindset, the worldview of people who are Gen Z below the age of 25, right? Like, what do you think we don't get?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that, so I wrote this piece for Fast Company about a year ago, and it was kind of about the shifting nature of work, right? Like, how does Gen Z think about work? So I'm an old Gen Z, I just turned 27. And it was really about like how young people are looking at the workforce and they're saying, I'm not going to do things like maybe the way that it's always been done. And so I think that's maybe the clearest divide between older millennials and Gen Z is a different approach to work style. This maybe doesn't apply to tech, where there tends to be more similarities between people. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, Gen Z is looking at things like, how do I explore the passions within this? How do I make sure it's a job I care about? I think there's been a lot of marketing terms like quiet quitting, great resignation. I don't know if I agree with those terms at large, but I do think that's emblematic of kind of the shift in the labor force to how the younger generation thinks. I think the millennials, because they graduated into the recession, they were like, I'm going to take any job I can. I'm freaking out. And it makes sense that they kind of devoted a large part of their lives to work. But I think, at least according to the polls and the anecdotal data I've collected, there's been more resistance to that to Gen Z. So I'd say that's probably the biggest.
Let me ask you maybe a sort of I would say somewhat like a slightly provocative follow-up. And I think there's a worldview often in people my age group, older age groups, which is the young people today don't work as hard, which I somehow think is a thesis or a message from time immemorial. I remember my parents saying it. And they're probably their parents said it, and the folks who had, and so, but I guess the question for you is, but then you look at quote unquote quiet quitting, or my favorite, well, not favorite, but the subreddit which got a lot of attention was the anti-work subreddit, which I'm sure you've heard of. And there does seem to be a rejection of the 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You go to work, you come back norms, right? And I'm guessing then, is there a fundamental difference? And it may be hard to articulate this without making some sort of value judgment, but is there a fundamental difference about people today are below the age of 25 and their willingness to be like, okay, I'm going to go work hard, I'm going to put in the hours, and then it maybe pays off down the road? There are a lot of assumptions baked in there, so feel free to pick apart at any of them, but this does come up a lot.
Yeah. No, and I think you're right that it comes up with every generation. But I think for the younger people, the model doesn't work, right? There used to be this corporate ladder that you were able to climb. And now, you have people that are taking much longer to retire. And so there isn't as much turnover in the companies. There isn't as much opportunity. The first firm that I started at, you saw that people just were stuck in jobs for like 20 years, when before that you would have moved up in like 5 years. And so I think that's definitely part of the resistance. I also think too, at least from a corporate level, the corporations are not as loyal to the employees. And I think that's something that we oftentimes don't talk about. We're like, no, it's the workers, but it's the corporations too. There's all sorts of layoffs. We don't have any really strong labor rights in the US. And so you saw this in tech, where a lot of people who had been hired during the pandemic, all of a sudden they turn around and they unfortunately don't have a job. And so I think that's part of the issue. And of course, tech companies have great benefits if you're able to get a job there. But I think for a lot of other people, benefits aren't so good. Retirement plans may not be that accessible, healthcare. So I think sort of what a company used to be to somebody, where you would go there and work 40 years, you'd have a huge pension. Like my grandma just turned 96, still has her pension from when she retired at 62. That's unheard of. And so I think that's the difference, is the relationship between the corporation and the employee has eroded.
Great. Wow. I totally agree.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we don't appreciate it enough, because we are from a different sort of like, when we joined, and then since we work entirely in tech, I think it's easy for us to sort of think about it as like the rest of the world sort of operates this way. And then it really doesn't, right? Like we see this like incredible disparity. I wanted to ask you about how we measure the economy, right? And when I look at all of your content, the biggest thing for me is like how much you simplify what's going on in the economy as such. And one of the things that you talk about is how it is really hard to have one single metric, whether it is GDP or inflation, or pick, a number of choice or some survey, that kind of thing. Why is it so hard to come up with one metric to go measure how we all are doing economically or feeling economically?
It's data collection issues. I think, most people would point to GDP as being like the biggest measure of the economy. Like it's capturing consumer spending, government spending, business investment, and exports and imports. And so like that's probably the best measure of overall economic health, but the pushback is it doesn't capture consumer happiness, right? Like it captures people spending, but doesn't mean they're happy. And so I think kind of the issue, and this is actually something I've been sort of obsessed with recently, is like data methodology is really tough. People don't respond to surveys. The consumer sentiment survey used to be a phone call. So they'd call you up and be like, how do you feel about the economy? And like for me, I would never answer the phone if I didn't know who it was. Yep. And there's a lot of people that are like that. And so like that's kind of the issue with data around the economy. And luckily in the US, like we have a lot of data sources, so you're able to create this broad tapestry. But you have to look at everything in conjunction, because data methodology can be so confusing because it's survey-based, people don't respond to data. Inflation metrics are lagged, like shelter costs are the primary driver of inflation right now. But if you look at real-time data, like from Zillow and Redfin, shelter costs are going down. It's just not showing up in the official government metrics yet. And so there's all of these like weird parts of data collection that make it hard to paint a picture with just one number. And I think it's good that we look at a lot of different metrics, because if we had just one, nobody would believe it. So it's good to have multiple. The foundation is better than just one poll.
I was actually going to say, I think you just said that at the end, but if I could, I would say in some ways, not having a metric is a good thing. And so I actually think not having perfect data and metrics could sometimes be a feature, not a bug. And bear with me, I think for two reasons. One is, I'm sure you're familiar with what Goodhart's law is, right? The idea is that when you pick any metric and you make it a target, right? It could be like, DAUs for social media companies or some such thing. It ceases to be useful. Basically, underneath it, what winds up happening is that people wind up gaming it in all sorts of ways, where you now have these effects which are not being captured by the metric, which then wind up dominating whether the metric is good or not. And which is why, historically, and there's this fantastic book, which, I highly recommend. It's called Seeing Like a State, which talks about this history of how various kind of, mostly communist countries or other countries, when they be like, hey, we need to get the number of trees up, and they have, various levels of bureaucrats, measured on that. Turns out that, they do this one thing and then everything else kind of becomes weird. So sometimes I feel like having multiple metrics or stuff in the ether is good, because I think you point out, in many other people, like GDP is sometimes imprecise, and there are certain countries which can maybe game GDP in ways where you're not actually capturing, whether people are just happy, and, are they living good, fulfilling lives? So maybe it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like taking the wolves out of Yellowstone, right? And then the deer population runs rampant. It's like, you do have these pillars that are important to keep in place. And it's the same thing with data methodology. But yeah, it's really interesting. There's actually, this is like very niche, but there's a lot of conversations around the accuracy of economic data. And we've been using, the problem with these metrics is that we use them to figure out what the direction of monetary policy. And so there's these huge decisions that are made on the backbone of this data. JOLTS, job openings and labor turnover survey, response rate is 30%. That's one of the key metrics that the Fed looks at to gauge the strength of the labor market. And that's probably not a good metric, right? And so I think that's the more concerning thing is the numbers that we're looking at aren't telling us the whole story, which is why it's important to look at the tapestry. But yeah, it's quite interesting, in 2024 that we would be having data collection problems.
Yeah, for me, as much as I completely agree with what Sriram's saying and what you're saying too, which is having one metric, then you start gaming it. I get the side. Sure. But the other side of it is vines and a bad news cycle, which is most news cycles, sort of start to erode on just confidence of people, being like, oh my God, everything's shit. Nothing's good anymore. And everything is sensationalistic headline and tend to be negative as such when you think about media. And so when people start to derive from that, and I think you had also talked about this which was objectively, people are making more money or saving more money, and yet they would be like, no, I don't think things are good. And by every sort of measure, things right now are better than what it used to be for a large cohort of the population. And yet the feeling and the vibe is that things are not great. So to me, this is the other side of the same coin, right? It's yes, you don't have a single metric, and maybe that's okay, but the bad part is now everybody just goes off of feelings, and you sort of have to think about, is it time for us to cut back on these vibes and really start thinking about quantifying things more or better? And I'm not sure where the answer lies.
Well, I mean, part of the problem with that is we're kind of in this, I don't love saying it, but we're sort of in a post-truth society.
Yes.
Where even if you do have data sources, people are like, I don't believe that. And the economy is a really personal experience. But yeah, it's, I think it'd be great if we went more, I think we should go more quantitative. But people, they do look at sensationalized news headlines. Media sentiment has become extremely negative. There's this great graph that shows it just sentiment of headlines, downward. what do you do about that? Of course, people feel bad, right?
Yeah. Kyla, we work in the tech industry. Trust me, we get negative media sentiment. It's all we've gotten for like 10 years, but I think it's true for not just for tech, for everyone. But I guess, one of the things I love about what you do is, you talk not just the economy, but you talk about sort of these broader social internet trends. And one particular trend, which you talk about the post-truth society, is us no longer having a monoculture. Very simply, the idea that, hey, you don't have one thing you listen to, you have these various niches that you jump into, right? And every once in a while, there's something magical that brings us all together. Maybe it's the Super Bowl or the Tom Brady roast, maybe the presidential debate, which was last night at the time we're recording this. But usually we're kind of living in our own little bubble. Now, I think there's maybe two ways to look at it. Well, there's one way which is kind of like, let's get back to the good old days and let's get, CBS or NBC telling you every day, hey, this is the way it was. And, you kind of have this set of beliefs that everyone ascribe to. But I'm kind of curious, you kind of being on the internet, do you think there is a way back to that world, or are we just going to be diverging in these multiverse of opinions and niches? And if so, what is the answer to actually telling people like, hey, maybe the economy is doing well and your experience is not everyone else's experience? What is the answer here? This is a very simple question.
No, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. Yeah, it's like half of the comments I am sort of battling is and it's I get it. Like people are like, my lived experience is my rent going up by $500 and my groceries going up by $30 and my car payments, through the roof. Why are you telling me the GDP is up, right? And I think we kind of have this like bifurcated society. Wealth inequality is a huge issue. And then you also have just inequality within generations. Like a huge cohort of millennials is going to inherit a large sum of wealth from their boomer parents. A huge cohort isn't, right? Like a lot of people are able to get the golden 2 to 3% mortgage rate. A lot of people aren't. And so you have just kind of like this continued separation between people. And then you do have the internet, which has allowed people to sort of, shovel away into their preferred echo chamber. And I'm guilty of behavior like that too. It's really important that you make sure you monitor what you're intaking. But I don't really know how you convince people of data. It's something I spent the past couple of years working on, and I think it's hard because it's just for the economy, but the economy is really personal, as I said a couple of times, and people take what you say about it personally, and nobody likes to think in averages. They like to think in anecdote.
Yeah, but I will say this. I'll make a statement then leading to a question, which is, I think in a way you're helping, because what you're doing is actually storytelling and simplification in a way that reaches people in 2024, as opposed to them having the MSNBC scroll on or whatever it is that people used to do. And I think what you're doing is actually telling people, hey, this is how the world is working. And I think it's hugely valuable, which is maybe a great topic which I want to really get on, because you're obviously, there's one way to look at you, which is you're an economist, you are educating people. Another way I look at you is you are fantastic as a content creator, right? As somebody on social media. And trust me, it's an art and a science. And I'm guessing, when you look at your journey as a creator on YouTube, on TikTok, I know you've left Twitter, which, you don't like you don't like the vibes of Twitter as much as before. Which I thought you said that. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay. Well,
no, you're right. It's scary. It's gotten scary. Yeah.
Yes. I was like, wait, was I making up some misinformation there? But but I guess the question is, what makes a great Kyla video work now? What have you learned about this in ways that you didn't know when you got started? Because I look at them and they're like, wow, this person really knows how to create great content, and it's not just about economy, just because you figured it out. So, what do you know about making great videos?
Oh, well, thank you for the kind words. I mean, so the video, I try to always evolve. So for a while, I was doing skits where I pretended to be Jerome Powell and I pretended to be Kathy Woods, and that had to change because the economy got a lot more serious. We weren't in the meme stock era anymore. And so then I started making stuff on my whiteboard, explainers on the whiteboard. And then more recently, I've just started to sit down and, put my phone up on the computer and talk into it. So I try to always change up the style because you are competing against the entire world, right? Like that people have the entire world at their fingertips and you're just part of their scroll session. So you want to make it as quick, as concise as possible. And so I try to take advantage of the entire medium. Like video is so special because you can have audio, you can have images on screen, you can have video clips within the video, you can have text on screen. The captions that you use are matter a lot. And so I don't know if I'm perfect at it. I'm definitely not perfect at it. I have a lot to learn. But I just try to continue to iterate on style and iterate on delivery and figure out what resonates and what's easiest for people to digest.
What is your state of the union in a very short way about YouTube versus Instagram versus TikTok versus X in, as we sit in end of June 2024?
Yeah, so I think TikTok is going to go away probably, or somebody's going to have to buy it. I think people are very worried about China's involvement with TikTok. I think X is, the reason I said it's scary is just because the harassment has gotten pretty unreal on there, and it just depends who you are. But I still think it's one of the best places to learn. The people that are on there sharing thoughts is phenomenal. It's like the first place that I went after the debate to figure out what just happened. It's great. And then, I think Instagram is very powerful. I think Mark Zuckerberg is just a force to be reckoned with. He's so impressive. I think people watch more YouTube than they do streaming services, right? Like more YouTube than Netflix. YouTube is very much favoring shorts over long form right now. So there's a big focus on shorts, but I'm curious to see if people get sort of sick of that, short snippets that's sort of taking over every brain cell that you have and, taking attention spans down. But yeah,
I think, I think there's a limited shelf life for that because I do feel like you can feel it. Like one of my best tests to ask people is after they have a 2-hour, 3-hour TikTok session or YouTube short session.
Oh, wow.
Can you remember a single video? Just
a single
pick one. For the last 2 hours, trust me, I can't do it. Right. And Aarthi tells me I'm spending too much time on phone. But just on Twitter and X, I spent a few years working on it. That was actually the first place I had firsthand sort of experience with some of these economic policies. Because what the X algorithm does is actually set the mimetic tone. I'll give you a fun story, and I'll elide some details. And after we finish Zoom, I can tell you the actual specifics. But one day I wake up and there's a story about a very famous, let's call this person a Hollywood celebrity who was going to lose his movie over some kerfuffle. A bunch of people were getting mad at him. And what caught my attention was that every one of the stories which referred to this person mentioned the same tweets, which had almost no traffic. And I was like, well, why is that happening? So I went and did some debugging, and it turned out that morning there was a bug in the Twitter trending algorithm, which basically said like, oh, these things are trending, even though they were not actually trending, but it said it was trending. So there's reflexivity happening here. Then there's another part of the product which is meant to take trends and make it like a really big visual and a big screen. So it said, hey, these two people saying this nasty thing, let's give it like 1,000 pixels and make it a big visual imagery. So this is at 6 a.m. New York time. 7, 8 a.m. New York time, a bunch of editors wake up and they're like, hey, Twitter's talking about this. This is going to be a real thing. And by noon New York time, the celebrity was in a whole lot of trouble, right? All because of 2-3 tweets going viral. So, and this is kind of a fun story, but I have so many stories where you can really, really shape the memetics and, of social discussion. And you can imagine this being on politics, on much more serious topics. So that's kind of one story. Maybe one last fun question, which I want to ask you on before we wrap up is, I love how you talk about just you have these great predictions for 2024, which I'm going to link to, and we're going to make sure people see it. But one of your fun predictions is it's about simplicity, but you talk about how whole milk is going to come back in style. Okay, yeah, so yeah. Kyla, why are you part of the whole milk industry?
Oh my complex? God. Oh, this is so online. It's a very online take, but there's been a rise in traditionalism. Sort of this trad wife. Are you familiar with that term, trad wife?
Yes, we spent way too much time on
Oh God, but it's like a return to traditional values. If it works for some people, but I think that there's a lot of desire to have a return to traditionalism within food too. And the whole milk take was just because at every I visit New York quite a bit for work, every coffee shop I went to, somebody was ordering whole milk. And I just think it's going to be a trend. People are looking at that and they're like, this is a good source of fats. It's, not an almond milk, which is bad for the environment. We all know oat milk is questionable as a health source. So I think people just kind of want to return to not altered food. Yeah. So that was that take.
Thank you. Thank you. Because, I spent years in San Francisco where I'll go to a coffee shop and they'd be like, oh, the one thing milk we don't have is whole milk. And I'd be like, what is going on? Right? Like almonds don't have milk, right? Like, they are not cows. But anyway, so there you have it, folks. Kyla Scanlon, part of the whole milk industrial complex, right? Like, the whole milk lobby group.
I'm lactose intolerant, but I support from afar.
Okay. Kyla, you are a delight, and I can't recommend highly enough that, I was talking to Tyler Cohen about you coming on the show, and we were talking about how we're all such fluent, and, you are a star. I'm looking forward to seeing you kind of continue on this amazing trajectory. So where do people find you online?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter or X, Kyla Scan. My username everywhere is Kyla Scan. So on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube. I have a newsletter, kyla.substack.com. I have a podcast called Let's Appreciate. And then my book came out a month ago at time of recording called In This Economy. And you can buy the audiobook, you can buy the hard copy. And then the audiobook is narrated by me. So
yeah. Well, the book is fantastic. I don't often buy physical hard copies, but this way, highly, highly recommended. I mentioned Morgan Housel. I think outside of Psychology of Money, this is the only other book I've seen the last several years where I was like, wow, I can imagine somebody reading this in 10 years or 20 years. It'll be just as relevant. And so, Kyla, congratulations on job well done. Everyone, get a copy, follow her. But your delight. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Such a blast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.